His pocket watch survived. He did not. Welcome to Detective Echoes. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from? So glad you've joined this journey of deduction. Let the case unfold. It was one of those April mornings when a light drizzle clung to Baker Street, like a lingering spectre, giving the cobbled thoroughfare a sombre hue. I had been thinking about today's issue of the Times, sipping lukewarm tea, when Sherlock Holmes, in his dressing gown and slippers, strode out of his room with a telegram in his hand and an illegible gleam in his eye. Without a preamble, he handed it to me. "Read this, Watson." Quickly. I obeyed, unfolding the crumpled paper and scanning its contents. To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, urgent and most puzzling matter. A man died in impossible circumstances. Witnesses claim he died within seconds of no apparent cause. Request your presence immediately. Inspector Lestrade, Scotland Yard. Holmes walked over to the fireplace where the embers of the previous night's fire still glowed faintly. He tapped his long fingers against the mantelpiece, his mind clearly anticipating events. "Well, Watson," he said, "it seems spring hasn't come by itself. London offers us yet another riddle to sharpen our wits." "Died in seconds without apparent cause," I muttered, rereading the telegram. Could it be poison, a convulsion, or some rare affliction? Holmes gave a curt, dismissive nod. If it were that simple, Lestrade wouldn't bother summoning me. The man died quickly, yes, but there's more here. You'll notice he uses the word impossible. This is not typical of Lestrade's usual telegrams. "I suppose it's rather dramatic," I conceded, getting up to get my coat. "Who is this unfortunate man?" Holmes was already donning his Inverness cloak. "A watchmaker, Swiss, I believe, one Herr Felix Danziger, lived on Gresham Street, lived alone, made a modest reputation, restoring rare mechanical watches for London's wealthiest collectors. A curious trade to come to such an abrupt end. Do you know him?" "Only by reputation. I remember a monograph in the Watchmaking Gazette praising his restoration of the twin regulators of Charing House. How very Holmesian you are to have read." "The Watchmaking Gazette," I whispered. Holmes allowed himself a dry smile. "You never know when knowledge of escapement mechanisms might prove crucial." We took a cab through the gleaming London streets, which had turned grey in the drizzle. Gresham Street, though narrow and unassuming, carried the weight of old London, a place of humble tradesmen and quiet routines. We arrived at number 47, where a black-clad constable stood guard by the door, the gas lamp above him hissing in the morning damp. Inspector Lestrade was waiting inside, his bowler hat nervously clutched in one hand. He looked up with something between relief and unease. "Thank God you came, Mr. Holmes. I don't understand anything." Holmes nodded briefly. "The deceased?" "Back room. His shop was across the street, very tidy, very ordinary. But what happened was—" He paused, as if afraid to finish his thought. "Tell me everything," Holmes demanded, "from the beginning." Lestrade took a breath. Around 7 o'clock in the morning, his assistant, a young man named Peter Linklater, opened the door as usual. He found Danziger lying on the studio floor, dead, his eyes wide open, no injuries, no marks. And here's the worst part. He pointed to the back room, where the air was thick with the smell of oil and dust. There were 2 clients with appointments. One was waiting outside when it happened. He didn't hear anything. The other had only been inside for 20 seconds when Danziger collapsed. Holmes raised an eyebrow. 20 seconds? Lestrade nodded. Exactly. The man swears he came in, took off his hat, began to speak, and before a complete sentence had left his mouth, the watchmaker grabbed his chest and fell. Holmes turned abruptly. "You say he grabbed his chest, so the man grabbed it. Before he fell? Temporarily, yes, but no signs of heart failure, stroke or poisoning, according to the surgeon's initial examination." Watson and I exchanged glances. What about the witnesses? In the front room. Both shocked. Holmes entered the back room, his eyes scanning. Every corner like a hawk's. The room was no more than 10 feet wide, its walls lined with clocks, some antique, others gleaming with polished brass. A magnifying glass lay on the work table. An untouched teacup lay to one side. Danziger's body had already been removed, but the chalked outline remained on the wooden floor. Holmes crouched beside the outline, examining the space intently. No sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no disturbance. "None," said Lestrade. "And not a single clock is out of sync." This seemed to catch Holmes's attention. He moved abruptly, moving closer to a large grandfather clock in the corner. He leaned forward and inhaled. Oil, freshly applied. But not by the same hand as the others. He said softly. Watson frowned. "What do you mean?" Holmes didn't reply. He walked to the door frame and examined the handle, then knelt down to look under the workbench. He stood up with a thoughtful hum. "Was the assistant alone when he found the body?" Holmes asked. "Yes," said Lestrade. "Arriving at 6:55, I called. Danziger. He heard nothing, so he came by and found the body. The door was unlocked, no sign of forced entry." Holmes remained silent, lost in thought. Then he turned. "I wish to speak with both clients. Separately." Lestrade nodded. "Of course." As we entered the front room, Holmes stopped in front of one watch in particular, a curious, ornate pocket watch displayed in a velvet case. "Strange," he murmured. "What is it?" I asked. "This watch is precisely 6 seconds behind," I blinked. "It's surely not remarkable." Holmes smiled, but it was cold. "Unless it belonged to a man who lived to the rhythm of every second and died in less time." He turned to Lestrade. "Let's talk to the witnesses, and then, Watson, we'll come back here tonight. There's something this room will only say when all is quiet." And with that enigmatic statement, the real mystery began to unfold, silently as clockwork. The first witness sat stiffly on a rattan-backed chair under the modest lamp of the store's waiting room, his top hat resting on his knees, his hands clasped tightly around it. He was a man of about 40, tall and thin, with a beak-like nose and hollow cheeks. His frock coat bore faint traces of morning drizzle, and his shirt collar appeared slightly frayed. "Your name?" Holmes asked, crossing his arms. "Reginald Ambrose," the man replied in a tense voice. "I had an appointment to pick up a restored watch, a rare Breguet repeater that belonged to my late grandfather." "What time was your appointment scheduled for?" 7:30. "I arrived a few minutes early at 10 o'clock. So you were the one waiting outside?" "Yes. The door was closed but not locked. I was wondering whether to knock or wait when this young assistant arrived, Mr. Linklater. He seemed surprised that the door wasn't locked." Holmes paced slowly, his eyes moving from the man to the wall clocks. "And you haven't heard anything unusual?" "Not a sound. Just the ticking of the clocks inside. Everything was very orderly. It was strange, really." Then Mr. Linklater opened the door, called out, and when no one answered, he went in. A moment later, he shouted for help. Holmes studied the man carefully. "Have you ever met Mr. Danziger?" "Before. Only once, 2 weeks ago. I brought the watch to him to be repaired." "Quarrels? Disagreements over price, methods, timing?" "Not at all. He seemed courteous, though reserved. Very meticulous. His shop was the image of order. He took my watch with gloved hands and made me feel as if I had entrusted it to an artist rather than a craftsman." "Did he mention any other dates?" Ambrose hesitated. "Only that he was booked all week. He kept a strict schedule and said he didn't like surprises." Holmes glanced at Lestrade. "Bring in the second witness." The next man who entered had an entirely different appearance, a broad chest, a square jaw, and the self-assured air of a man accustomed to getting his own way. He was perhaps in his 30s, dressed fashionably and smelled of expensive cologne. His gloves were black leather, tucked neatly into his coat pocket. "Name?" Holmes asked dryly. "Philip Marchmont," the man said, adjusting his cufflink as he sat down. "Were you inside the store at the time of the incident?" "I was," Marchmont said. "I had an appointment at 7:30 sharp. I arrived exactly to the minute. The front door was already open. I went in and announced myself, as one does." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "And what happened then?" Marchmont moved. Danziger appeared from the back room. He looked a little pale, now that I think about it. Just as I started to explain why I'd come, he collapsed. Without warning, he clutched his chest. He hit the floor. It was dreadful. "And what did you do?" I called out. The boy came running from behind. We tried to wake Danziger, but it was clear. He was gone. "Did you have a watch with you?" "Yes. I brought a gold carriage clock for appraisal. French, early 19th century. Belonged to my wife's family. It's still in my briefcase if you'd like to see it." Holmes nodded slightly. "Later, and you say you spoke to him. Did he answer?" Marchmont frowned. "Not really. I might have surprised him, actually. He didn't greet me. He barely looked at me. I thought he was ignoring me until until this happened." Holmes leaned forward. "Did you see what he was working on?" "No. His work table was cluttered with small tools. I noticed the ticking, so many clocks ticking. It gave me a headache." Holmes stood still, then said, "And you had never met Mr. Danziger before?" "No, I only heard about him. Recommended by my club. The man had a reputation for excellence." When the witness was dismissed, Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Send young Mr. Linklater." A moment later, a pale-faced young man of about 20 entered the room. He fiddled with his shirt cuffs and stood nervously until Holmes motioned him to sit down. "Your full name?" Holmes asked. "Peter Linklater, monsieur." "How long have you worked here?" 8 months. I do odd repairs, nothing major. Mostly I just observe. Herr Danziger, he was precise to the minute. Every morning he arrived at 6:10, unlocked the shop, lit the lamps and made the tea. Always in that order. Holmes tilted his head. "And this morning?" Linklater bit his lip. "I arrived as usual at 5 to 7. I was early, hoping to finish repairing a marine chronometer, but the door was unlocked and that was wrong. It's never unlocked before 7. I called, no answer, so I went to the workshop." "And what did you see?" "He was lying there right next to the workbench, eyes open, tea untouched." "Anything else? Anything unusual?" Linklater hesitated. "Yes. The magnifying glass wasn't on his workbench. He always carried it. He said he couldn't work without it." Holmes raised his eyebrows. "Interesting. Did you see where he went?" "No, sir, it's just gone." Holmes stood up. "Thank you, Mr. Linklater, that will be all." As the young man left, Holmes turned to Lestrade and me. "A man who lives by order dies in chaos. That alone is telling." "Do you think someone tampered with the clocks?" I asked. "Not yet, but I think someone has tampered with the timing, and that, Watson, is much more delicate." We left the premises shortly after, the street outside glistening in a persistent drizzle. Holmes remained unusually silent during the taxi ride to Baker Street. Only once, as we approached our lodgings, did he speak. "Watson, what do you know about harmonic resonance?" I blinked. "Nothing beyond the physics lessons I've long since forgotten." Holmes smiled weakly. "It's a fascinating concept. Objects, even humans, have natural frequencies at which they vibrate. Strike the right note and a glass can shatter. Create the right sound in the right space, and something or someone can fall. Do you think the man was killed by the noise?" "I think," Holmes said, as we stepped out onto our fog-kissed sidewalk, "that we're dealing with a murder. Designed not to look like one, a death made to disappear in seconds. And I intend to slow down time long enough to catch the killer. That evening, After a modest dinner at which Holmes spoke little and smoked a great deal, we returned to Gresham Street under the deepening veil of London fog. The gas lamps flickered dimly in the mist, casting the street in an eerie gloom where shadows stretched like spectres, and every distant footstep echoed unnaturally. Officer Harrow greeted us at the store door. He was a stocky guy with a nose reddened by the cold and eyes mysterious enough not to ask too many questions. "No disturbances since this morning, Mr. Holmes," he said, tilting his helmet. "The place has been locked down and monitored. No one has entered or left." Holmes nodded curtly and entered without a word, the familiar smell of oil and brass thickening in the closed shop. I followed closely behind him, my boots creaking against the wooden floor. The store had a strangely impatient air. Every clock on the wall chimed softly, patiently, as if waiting for something more than the hour to strike. Holmes walked over to the workshop and lit the gas lamp with a practiced flick. The warm glow pushed back the darkness, illuminating the orderly jumble of tools, coils, gears, and springs. "Watson," Holmes said softly, "look how intact this room is. No overturned stool, no scattered tools, no broken glass." Danziger's death was brutal, yes, but don't panic. He didn't have time to react. "He just fell," I whispered, recalling the stories, as if the breath had been knocked out of him. Holmes crouched down again near the chalk outline, this time measuring the distance from the workbench to the floor with the length of his cane. He then turned to the wall of watches. "You remember, Watson, that I noticed that a watch was running precisely 6 seconds late." "Indeed, I assumed it was a simple mistake." "There's no mistake in Danziger's shop," Holmes replied. "Everything here is symmetrical, synchronized, except that one." He retrieved the watch in question, a silver piece with a richly engraved case and a sapphire-set crown, and placed it on the workbench. Opening the case, he examined the mechanism with his magnifying glass. His eyes narrowed. "It has been falsified," he announced. "How can you know that?" "The escapement was delicately filed, less than 0.5 millimeter, enough to alter the rhythm, slow the movement, but not enough for a layperson to detect. It wasn't a repair. It was a message." "A message," I echoed. Holmes tapped the inside of the case with his gloved finger. "It was returned to Danziger as a test, even an insult. Someone challenged his expertise. Perhaps the murderer used this watch to lure him into detection and death." He paused. "Watson, can you feel it?" I inhaled. "The usual. Oil, brass, a trace of tea. No, there's something else, faint, metallic, soft, almost gone, but still lingering beneath everything else." I tried again. There it was, the ghost of something abnormal, faint, acrid, and unmistakably chemical. "Chloroform," I guessed. "No," Holmes muttered. "Chloroform is heavier. It's more subtle. Something less crude." He walked over to the ventilation. Pipe above the workbench. A narrow shaft leading to the roof. Standing on the stool, Holmes peered down the shaft, then dropped a thin wire with a small hook on the end. When he pulled it out, a thin piece of parchment caught on the hook. He unfolded it carefully. "Printed vellum," he observed. "Stiff, wax-treated, barely visible writing. Ah, fluorescent ink. Watson, would you kindly dim the lamp?" I did as instructed. Holmes struck a match and held it close to the paper at an angle. Slowly, ghostly blue. Letters appeared on the surface. Holmes read aloud. "When seconds are missing, the master falls. Precision breeds pride. Pride breeds silence." He said nothing for several seconds. Then he carefully folded the bill and placed it in his pocket. "Good?" I asked. "It's a riddle, of course," he replied. "But more than that, it's a philosophy. The killer sees time not simply as a measurement, but as a judgment, a test of mastery." "Do you think Danziger was targeted?" "Without a doubt. It wasn't a robbery. Nothing was stolen. It was a performance. Holmes returned to the workbench and picked up the magnifying glass that had been missing earlier. It was now lying just under the radiator, perhaps knocked or dropped in haste. He examined it silently before passing it to me. The lens was cracked. "Watson, you're a doctor. Tell me, if a man examined this without realizing that the lens was fractured, could he see something he shouldn't see? Could light, bent through broken glass, cause eye strain? Maybe, although it's not fatal." "Okay," said Holmes, "but suppose the magnifying glass is rigged, some agent applied to the edge, invisible to the eye, something reactive, something which, when exposed to heat or moisture, say from the eye itself, might be absorbed and cause shock. Are you talking about chemical poisoning? Something like that, but too subtle for crude methods. Something modern. Something precise." He turned to me. "Remember our discussion about harmonic resonance?" I nodded. "What if the mechanism of death were twofold? Chemical disorientation combined with auditory assault. A note struck at just the right frequency, perhaps hidden within a ticking mechanism, a single sound intended for a single listener." I looked at him. "Do you think someone designed a clock to kill?" "I think someone designed armament kill, Watson." And Danziger, so sensitive to rhythm, symmetry, and precision, was the ideal victim. His body may not have withstood the pressure of manipulated perception. There was silence between us, interrupted only by the soft ticking of dozens of clocks. Holmes said suddenly, "We must visit the Marchmont residence, and then Mr. Ambrose's. I wish to see those clocks they have brought urgently. If either contains a second hand that does more than tick, we might find a hand behind the murder." The next morning a faint golden light rose through the ever-present London mist. Holmes was already dressed when I left my room, and he greeted me with that singular gleam in his eye which appeared only when a case reached the precipice of fascination. "Come, Watson," he said, buckling his scarf. "Our inquiries now turn to the country. The dead don't speak with words, but with things. Clocks, in this case. Let's see what the living keep close to home." We hailed a taxi from Baker Street to the Marchmont residence in Kensington, a wide, well-kept terrace with ivy along its brick facade and a brass door-knocker in the shape of a lion's head. Holmes observed the details with the eye of a man mapping a battlefield. A housekeeper answered our door and led us into a living room furnished in rich mahogany and green velvet. Philippe Marchmont soon joined us, dressed in a darker grey than the day before, though the confidence he wore like a second skin remained firmly in place. "To what do I owe this second visit, Mr. Holmes?" he asked, sinking into an armchair with casual grace. Holmes ignored the question. "The carriage clock. May I see it?" Marchmont blinked. "Certainly. I had it brought up from the office last night." He retrieved the object himself, a fine French watch in a gilt bronze case with a beveled crystal, the kind displayed as a marker of taste rather than necessity. Holmes carefully placed it on a table, removed his gloves and peered inside the mechanism through his lens. "A beautiful piece," he murmured. "Unrestored." "Unchanged for decades," Marchmont said. "My wife inherited it from her great-uncle. Until yesterday she had never examined it." Holmes didn't answer immediately. He turned a small knob on the side and listened. A deep, subtle chime sounded from within. Not loud, softer than a whisper, but strangely resonant. Even I, inexperienced as I was, sensed something vaguely unsettling in his tone. Holmes narrowed his eyes. "Have you ever found that sound disturbing?" "Disturbing?" Marchmont raised an eyebrow. "Not particularly. It rarely rings, and when it does, it's rather elegant." "Elegance can be deadly," Holmes said enigmatically. "Tell me, Mr. Marchmont, do you know the name Theodore Renault?" Marchmont looked momentarily surprised. "No, should I be?" He was a French watchmaker of singular genius and unusual cruelty. Banished from the Paris Watchmaking Guild for designing instruments that not only told the time, but also manipulated those who observed them. He disappeared in 1876. What does this have to do with my clock? Holmes smiled slightly. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. The internal mechanism here, although of French origin, features a peculiar modification. The escape wheel has been replaced by a hybrid design I've only seen once before. And where was it? In the case of a banker who suffered epileptic seizures. Every time his office clock struck the quarter hour, the frequency of the sound just below conscious hearing was tuned to be disturbing. Holmes turned the clock again. Has your wife ever complained of headaches or disorientation near this room? Now that you mention it, Marchmont said slowly, she always hated the clock. She said it gave her migraines, but I thought that was a coincidence. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Coincidence is the comfort of the incurious. We left soon after, Holmes carefully holding the clock on his knee during the journey back to Baker Street. What do you think of Marchmont? I asked. He's not our murderer, Holmes said flatly. But he's not innocent either. In what sense? He knows more than he admits. He recognized Renault's name but chose to deny it. Yet his clock bears Renault's markings, coded but unmistakable. Either he's been dealing with someone in possession of Renault's creations, or he's a collector of dangerous objects. And Ambrose, Holmes tapped the side of the clock. That, Watson, is our next investigation. We found Reginald Ambrose in his modest Bloomsbury residence, a dusty, velvety place lined with shelves containing newspapers, ledgers, and 1,000 trinkets of mechanical life. A man who lived alone, except for the silent ticking of his collection. He greeted us in his bathrobe and slippers, visibly surprised by our unexpected arrival. I'm afraid I didn't have time to prepare. We won't be long, Holmes interjected. The Breguet repeater you got from Herr Danziger, may I see it? Ambrose hesitated, then walked over to a locked glass case. Inside, lying on a navy velvet cushion, was a pocket watch of extraordinary craftsmanship. He handed it to Holmes as one would a holy relic. I only received it the day before yesterday, Ambrose explained. I haven't had the heart to put it back together yet. I'm still wondering if Danziger left something unfinished. Holmes examined it respectfully. Exquisite. Almost perfect. He opened the box and studied the mechanism. Then his expression changed, slightly but perceptibly. Watson, he said. Observe. I leaned over. The hairspring shone, not with varnish, but with an almost imperceptible film. Holmes touched it with a cloth and exposed the result to the light. A coating, he said. Probably organic, clear, almost invisible. Ambrose looked puzzled. Is he dangerous? Only if misused, Holmes murmured, but dangerous enough to suggest someone modified this watch after Danziger's repairs were completed. But who? That is the question, Holmes said. We returned to Baker Street just after noon. Holmes placed the two clocks, the carriage and the repeater side by side on the table. Then he drew the blinds, plunged the room into darkness and switched on both devices. The room was filled with a soft ticking sound, at first ordinary, then subtly, unsettlingly different. A frequency appeared, high, low, then high again, a rhythm that wasn't quite rhythm, not quite noise. I felt it before I heard it, like pressure against the ears behind the eyes. Enough, I said, stepping back. Holmes silenced the clocks and looked towards me. Danziger may have deciphered this. He understood it. He knew that someone had weaponized time, but when he realized OMSI had done it, it was too late. Who then? Holmes watched the clocks in silence. Then he said, We must return to Scotland Yard. There is one name Lestrade omitted from his witness list, the name of the last client, to cancel his appointment with Danziger the night before his death. I frowned. And you think this person is... The key? Holmes turned to me, his gaze piercing. Watson, I believe this person designed time to kill, and they may already be setting the next clock. It was late afternoon when Holmes and I arrived at Scotland Yard. The gas lamps inside flickered against the wood-panelled walls, and the smell of coal smoke and paper ink gave the place its usual grim determination. The detective office buzzed with quiet activity, telegrams being sent, statements being filed, suspects being processed, but Holmes moved about as if immune to the administrative clutter of the courts. Inspector Lestrade looked up from his desk as we approached, his eyes rimmed with weariness. Back already, Holmes? I'm here for your omissions, Holmes replied briskly. You said Danziger had 2 appointments that morning, Ambrose and Marchmont, but you neglected to mention who cancelled the day before. Lestrade blinked, then rummaged through a stack of notes. Oh yes, there was a 3rd client scheduled the day before at 7 o'clock sharp. A woman she cancelled less than an hour before. Her name was Madame Veronique Duval. Holmes's expression flickered between recognition and disbelief. Duval. Curious. Do you know her? I know of. She, said Holmes. A French patron saint of obscure scientific curiosities, formerly associated with the avant-garde salons of Montmartre before moving to London in 1889. Her tastes are exotic, and her money seems inexhaustible. Lestrade frowned. Do you think she had something to do with Danziger's death? I think, Holmes replied, that a woman who collects hearing devices designed to alter perception, her exact words in an interview with The Illustrated World, if I remember correctly, should never be ignored in a case involving sound frequencies and mechanical manipulation. He turned to me. Come on, Watson. We're bound for Chelsea. Madame Duval's residence was a 4-story townhouse located on Cheyne Walk, overlooking the Thames like a quiet sentinel. The building was elegant but unostentatious, with ironwork balconies and tall windows veiled by thick curtains. The house was silent even from the outside, as if sound itself hesitated to enter. A middle-aged servant with a rigid posture and an expression like polished stone greeted us at the door. We request an audience with Madame Duval, Holmes said, showing his card. The butler watched him and then disappeared without a word. A minute later, he returned and led us up a carpeted staircase to a second-floor sitting room. The room was unlike any I'd ever seen, furnished entirely in deep blue and silver. No portraits hung on the walls. Instead, intricate brass mechanisms, tuning forks of varying lengths, and suspended pendulums formed a sort of silent orchestra. Madame Duval herself sat by the window, wearing a midnight-coloured velvet dress. Her hair was tied high in a style that had gone out of fashion a decade ago, and a thin cigarette trailed smoke between her long fingers. "Gentlemen," she said with a honeyed accent of Parisian aristocratic roots, "to what do I owe this? Intrusion?" Holmes inclined his head. "On the death of Herr Felix Danziger." A flicker, barely visible, crossed his expression. Surprise, amusement. "I couldn't tell, I heard," she whispered. "Such a tragedy, a master of his craft. You cancelled your meeting with him the day before he died." "I did it." "For what?" Madame Duval took a long drag on her cigarette before answering. "Because I was uncomfortable." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Worried?" She casually pointed to a small brass device on a table next to her. "Danziger sent me a prototype, something I had ordered. I collect objects that aren't simply measure the world, but change it. I asked him to build me a chronosonic amplifier, a device designed to make inaudible frequencies perceptible to the human ear." Holmes's eyes glittered. "And he succeeded?" "To a certain extent. But the sound it made, barely audible, was disturbing. Not in tone, but in effect. I played it once and became violently ill. The sensation persisted for hours. I wrote to him that evening to cancel. I intended to speak to him later, when I felt less angry. She exhaled slowly. Now I never will. Holmes walked over to the device. It looked like a brass shell mounted on a wooden base, with dials on the side and a coiled diaphragm in the center. He gently turned one of the knobs, and a soft hum filled the room, not loud or high-pitched, but heavy, like air thickened with noise. I involuntarily grabbed the back of a chair. Holmes's hand froze on the knob. "Here we go," he said. "Now." Madame Duval obeyed, bringing the room back to silence. Holmes spoke softly, almost to himself. "Danziger built this?" "He did it." "Where did he learn to do it?" Madame Duval smiled enigmatically. "Ask him." Holmes turned. "He's dead, madam." She stood up. "Then maybe someone else finished the job. Does anyone like Theodore Renaud?" This broke the mask. Her eyes widened slightly. Then calmly, she said, "I heard his name. He was brilliant, dangerous, but he's long gone." Holmes looked around the room one last time. "Thank you for your time, ma'am. You have been very enlightening." As we descended the stairs, Holmes whispered, "She's lying, Watson," I gathered. "She speaks of Renaud as a myth, but her house is filled with his plans. This amplifier wasn't Danziger's invention. It was Renaud's, refined by a second hand. And you believe that this second hand belonged to the killer?" "I believe," Holmes said gloomily, "that someone has taken Renaud's theories and turned them into a murder weapon. And now that Danziger is dead, they may be preparing to silence those who have come too close to their secret." That night, Holmes barely slept. He spread out on the living room table the diagrams we had photographed at Madame Duval's, comparing them with the sketches he was drawing from memory of the internal mechanisms of Marchmont's and Ambrose's clocks. "It's not just about the sound," he told me around 3 a.m. modulation, "on inducing vulnerability at specific frequencies. Imagine striking a note that doesn't resonate with glass but with the human mind." I rubbed my eyes. But for what purpose? Holmes looked at me, and for the first time I saw not excitement, but a trace of unease. Kill without touching, silence without blood, erase a man in a second. He stood up abruptly. "There's one more spot, one last clue Danziger may have left behind. Or his home. We searched the store, yes, but not the place where he retreated every night. If he suspected he was being followed, threatened, or watched, that's where he would have written it." I stood up, already dressed. "Shall we go now?" Holmes's voice was low but firm. "No, we wait until dawn. A killer who operates in rhythm will expect visitors at predictable times. We must break the pattern if we hope to survive." As the sun rose over the slate roofs of Clerkenwell, the city was beginning to stir in that familiar mechanical way. The chime of milk carts, the muffled footsteps of chimney sweeps, the early morning whistling of kettles. Holmes and I, however, were already 3 streets from Danziger's shop, past the modest brick building where the watchmaker had lived, an unassuming residence wedged between a tobacconist's and a shuttered hatter's. Danziger's landlady, a stout woman named Mrs. Merrow with a face like a flour-dusted pudding and eyes full of suspicion, met us at the door with a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "If you're with Yard," she began. "Sherlock Holmes," said Holmes briskly. "This is my associate, Dr. Watson. We have come concerning Herr Danziger's lodgings." Mrs. Merrow's resistance softened somewhat at the name. "He's a horrible case, a quiet man, that one. Not one to make a fuss. But he wasn't quite right these last few weeks. Jumpy. He shut his door harder than usual. He kept the blinds closed, even when the weather turned. Did he receive visitors? Never, or if they did, they used the back. I would sometimes hear knocking, like a kind of coded knock on the back door late at night. Holmes raised his eyebrows. Interesting. She led us up a narrow, creaky staircase to the second floor. The hallway smelled of shoe polish and old paraffin. Danziger's door bore a series of precisely placed brass locks. Mrs. Merrow handed over the key. Holmes unlocked the door and entered. The room was cold, the curtains drawn. A single desk lamp cast long shadows across a sparse but obsessively tidy living room. A bed with sheets folded at military angles. A bookcase filled with volumes on acoustics, mechanics, and human anatomy. No art, no frivolity. The whole space looked more like the inside of a stopwatch than a house. Holmes immediately went to the desk and ran his fingers over its surface, his eyes turning to the drawer handles. "Watson, help me lift this top panel." It took some effort, but the desk surface lifted with a slight noise. Click, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small red notebook, its leather binding worn from repeated use. Holmes opened it slowly and began to read, his eyes darting faster and faster until he suddenly stopped. He handed me the book. The last page said, "I finished it." I heard the sound. "It's a beautiful terror. Marchmont thinks it will disrupt. Duval knows it will unravel. But someone has modified it. The device is no longer mine. It's been readjusted. Subtle changes, decibels, rhythm. The amplifier is no longer a target. It's a trigger. I must confront it. If I don't return, the blue coil watch holds the key." Holmes was already standing, scanning the room. "Blue coil," I repeated. "Could he be talking about the watch we saw in the store?" "No. That one had a sapphire-set winder, not a bobbin. He must have kept the other one here." Holmes turned to a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. Inside, wrapped in velvet, was a small package. He unwrapped it carefully. It was a pocket watch unlike any I'd ever seen. Sleek, dark case. Its backplate was transparent, revealing an internal mechanism that glowed faintly blue, a coil of fine braided wire encased in glass. The second hand didn't tick. It glided smoothly and without interruption in an almost hypnotic motion. Holmes turned it over. "There's an inscription." I leaned over. He said, "Time should measure the truth, not bury it." Before I could speak, Holmes suddenly stiffened. His head turned slightly, like a fox scenting something in the undergrowth. "There's someone in the building," he whispered. He turned off the lamp with a quick movement, plunging us into near-total darkness. For a long moment, we heard only silence. Then the slightest creak, just one, echoed through the stairwell. Holmes motioned for me to stay still and slipped over to the door, opening it ajar. He peered through the gap and froze. "What is it?" I whispered. Holmes stepped back, his face pale. "Mrs. Merrow is on the floor, unconscious." I instinctively stepped around him and stepped out into the hallway. The landlady was lying at the foot of the stairs, a slight gash on her temple. No sign of a struggle, no trace of the attacker. "She's breathing," I said after checking her pulse. Holmes examined the wall behind her and pointed to a barely perceptible mark. A gloved handprint, faint but definite. "Someone came in, knocked her unconscious, and then—" He turned, tried to get into the room. We quickly returned. The blue coil watch had disappeared. Holmes scanned the room like a bloodhound. "A subtle misstep," he muttered. "They thought Danziger was hiding something valuable, maybe a plan. But they underestimated him. He didn't trust paper." He walked over to the shelf and began pulling out volumes. One by one, he flipped through the pages until he stopped at a large volume titled Sonics and the Sensory Mind. A hole had been torn through the middle pages. Inside, a folded diagram and a small brass key. Holmes opened the diagram carefully. It showed an exploded view of the blue coil watch with annotations, wavelengths, and frequency ranges. He built a device that emitted his precisely fatal sound, Holmes murmured. But the key, what does it open? Then he stopped, blinked once and said, "Of course, the grandfather clock. The one in his workshop?" Holmes shook his head. "No, the one from Marchmont's house." "But you said Marchmont wasn't the killer." "I said he wasn't the murderer. But he is something else. A collector. A guardian. Perhaps a catalyst." He tapped the diagram. Duval ordered the amplifier. Marchmont may have organized the prototype, but someone else, someone unknown, tuned the final instrument to kill. This watch, this schematic, this key, they were never meant to be together. Someone put them together. Someone played the role of composer on Danziger's instrument. A faint hum filled the room. It came from the ground. We both looked down. A ticking, not of a clock, but of something beneath the floorboards, subtle, metronomic. Holmes knelt down and pressed his ear to the E wood. His face darkened. "We have to go now." Without explanation, he pulled me into the hallway, gently threw the landlady over his shoulder, and descended the stairs 2 at a time. Just as we reached the street, a muffled noise, popular, not an explosion, but an impulse, a dull thud under pressure, reverberated from the building. A window shattered, no flames, no smoke, just a collapse of the silence that followed. Back on the street, Holmes gently set Mrs. Merrow against the side of the building and looked up at the shattered windows above. "They set up a sound trap," he said, "a small speaker or resonator designed to detonate the mechanism when the watch's frequency matches the chart." He looked at me gravely. "The killer wanted Danziger's work erased." "Not stolen, erased. And now?" I asked. Holmes looked out at the grey morning. "Now we stop theorizing." He brandished the brass key. "Because whoever is orchestrating all of this just made their first mistake." The next day was a study in unspoken tension. Holmes paced Baker Street with the restlessness of a hound rejected from hunting. The fragments of the case, Madame Duval's sonic devices, Marchmont's suspicious clock, the missing blue coil watch, and the destruction of Danziger's room, spinned around us like centerless clock hands. The deeper we delved into the case, the more it resisted clarity. And yet, for all its complexity, I could see in Holmes a growing confidence, the certainty of a man who had finally glimpsed the architecture behind the illusion. Around noon, he suddenly stopped pacing and turned towards me. "Watson, bring your revolver." That was all he said before gathering a selection of objects: Danziger's diagram, a velvet cloth from the mantelpiece, a silver tuning fork retrieved from a small box, and a metronome, and placing them in his coat pocket. He then opened a drawer and removed a small folded suit, a workman's cap, thick lensed glasses, and a smock. "I guess we're not doing a social call," I remarked. "We are not," he replied. "We are going to visit a man who does not exist, and yet who has killed with impunity." Holmes's plan, as it unfolded in fragments during our taxi ride to Southwark, was as audacious as it was precise. He intended to bait the killer not with evidence but with conception, to attract him by reproducing the last piece he believed to have been destroyed, the blue coil watch. "But we don't have the watch anymore." I reminded him. "We don't need it," Holmes replied. "We have Danziger's notes, the frequency range, the harmonic intervals, and even the dimensions of the casing. We don't need the weapon. We only need the blueprint. We'll throw it like meat before a hungry wolf." "And where are we going to hang?" Holmes smiled grimly. "At the source, the very place where Marchmont acquired its so-called heritage clocks." The address Holmes provided was in a dark alley off Borough High Street, a narrow, sooty passageway that smelled of coal dust and rusty metal. It led to a small coppersmith's factory, with soot-stained windows and a door that bore no sign. "Clockmakers." Holmes murmured as we approached, are a dying breed. But creators of special commissions, they remain in high demand among collectors and murderers. The interior of the shop was a cavern of metal and shadows. Shelves lined with gears, spools, brass cases and antique toolboxes surrounded a low workbench beneath a yellow gas lamp. A man sat hunched over it, his face obscured by the magnifying glass fixed over his left eye. He didn't look up. "Closed," the man said curtly. "By appointment only." Holmes, now fully disguised, removed the plan from his coat and gently placed it on the bench. "I've been told you could help me build something highly specialized." This caught the man's attention. He raised his head, piercing grey eyes, a chiseled face, a thin mouth. He wore the grime of industry and the confidence of someone who had nothing to fear. He removed his magnifying glass and examined the drawing. His fingers hesitated, just slightly. "Where did you get that?" Holmes replied with a shrug and a slight Midlands accent. "A Frenchman passed it on. He said you were the only one who could set the reel correctly. He told me to bring payment in. 2 days. He wanted it built exactly." The man slowly folded the diagram. Too slowly. "And what is an interest in this device?" Holmes approached. "Curiosity, payment, or perhaps just precision?" The man said nothing for a long moment. Then, with icy calm, he looked Holmes straight in the eye. "You're not a customer," he said. "You're a question." "And you," replied Holmes, discarding the accent, "are the answer." It happened in a flash. The man grabbed something from under the workbench, but Holmes was quicker. He tipped the table over with one hand, knocking the man off balance, while I advanced with my revolver drawn. "Stand up slowly," I ordered, "or I swear I won't hesitate." The man froze. Then, with a smirk, he stood up, his hands half raised. "You have no evidence," he said. "No crime to accuse me of." "Oh, but we do," said Holmes. "You see, we knew you'd panic if you believed the watch still existed. Danziger's records were destroyed, yes, but the diagram survived, and you almost admitted authorship." I only glanced at one drawing. Holmes approached. "Not only did you recognize the design, but you responded with intent. That intent almost cost you your freedom." The man sneered. "You still don't have a name for me." Holmes showed the plan. "But Renaud, yes." A glow crossed the man's face, momentary, almost imperceptible. "But there." Holmes continued. "I know who—" "You are Theodore Renaud. Or should I say the man who took his name? The real Renaud died in Belgium in 1878, buried beneath his own malfunctioning mechanism. However, you inherited his research. You perfected it. You turned it into something Danziger barely grasped in time. You're crazy." "No," said Holmes, his voice soft and deliberate. "You are arrogant. You lured Danziger with promises of collaboration. You used Marchmont's patronage and Duval's commissions to insert your designs into the company under the guise of watchmaking. And when Danziger realized what you had turned his work into, a sonic scalpel for the mind, you silenced him." The man said nothing. Holmes backed away. "But you made a mistake. You didn't account for the residue. Resonance leaves traces of particles on coils. Danziger's watch was tested before you retrieved it. The chemical signature on the spring is rare, an alloy you created. A unique blend of ruthenium and beryllium. Scotland Yard has the sample. They'll match it to the coil in your drawer." The man's expression remains provocative, but his jaw clenches. Slightly. Holmes nodded to Lestrade, who, unbeknownst to our suspect, had entered through the back as instructed by Holmes. 2 constables surrounded him. "I think that's your cue, Inspector." Lestrade stepped forward. "Theodore Renaud, if that is your name, you are under arrest for the murder of Felix Danziger and the illegal creation and use of deadly sonic devices. You may speak to a lawyer, although I warn you, Mr. Holmes's deductions tend to outstrip legal defense." Back on Baker Street that evening, Holmes sat in his chair, the fire casting soft shadows across his profile. I poured us both a glass of brandy and watched the man beside me retire once more into thoughtful silence. It was clever, I said finally, to pretend to have the diagram, but it was dangerous. He nodded. A calculated risk. But the man couldn't resist the temptation to see his work survive. Even monsters crave recognition. And Marchmont? Duval? Neither. Committed the murder, but both enabled it. Duval will quietly disappear from society. Marchmont could still be accused of inadvertent endangerment. He financed Renault's studio. Everyone believed they were cultivating art. Only Danziger saw that art had become a weapon. Holmes lifted the tuning fork he had been carrying earlier and struck it lightly against the table. A soft hum filled the room, soft, neutral, pure. Sound is power, Watson, he said. It can soothe, summon, terrify, even kill. In the right hands, a frequency is a blade, but in the wrong hands, it's music for the grave. He let the buzzing fade into silence. Then, without another word, he turned back to the fire, watching the last embers fall, just as the weather had predicted. The Baker Street drawing room had become, on that grey April evening, a theatre of memory and revelation. The rain clung gently to the windows, obscuring the street beyond in a film of blurred light and shadow. Holmes sat under the lamp, his violin untouched, his long fingers clasped before his lips as he prepared to lift the veil that had obscured the case from the beginning. I had long since taken my notes. The revelations of the last 24 hours had been astounding. A hidden identity, a sonic murder, and a complex conspiracy embedded in the disappearance of a simple watchmaker. Yet, as always, the final unraveling belonged to Holmes alone. "I hope," he began, "that you are ready for what comes next, Watson." "As always," I said, my pen ready again. He nodded. "You will recall that the first anomaly, even before the murder, was that single 6-second difference in the silver pocket watch on Danziger's display table. This was no mere defect. This watch had been falsified. The escapement has been filed to run imperceptibly slowly, but not for a mistake, because message." "Yes," I said. "You thought it was a deliberate hint." "Indeed. This modification wasn't intended to disrupt Danziger's work, but to warn him, or to provoke him. And that's what happened. Danziger, a man of obsessive precision, would have recognized the modification immediately. He would have known that someone had infiltrated his profession, someone who spoke the same silent language of mechanical time. Holmes stood up and walked towards the fireplace, his voice rising. "That someone," he continued, "was the man we apprehended yesterday. A brilliant forger of watchmaking art posing under the stolen name of Theodore Renaud. The real Renaud died nearly 2 decades ago. Our man adopted his identity, along with his unfinished research on the application of harmonic frequencies to human perception. I interject, the same principles that Danziger had tried but refused to exploit. Precisely. Renaud saw potential where Danziger saw danger. The amplifying device, commissioned by Madame Duval, was just the beginning. It was a prototype. But Renaud went further. He adapted the concept into a deadly form. Micro-vibratory resonance adapted to human neuronal vulnerability. He returned to his chair and retrieved the now infamous plan from the table. "This," he said, tapping on it, "was Danziger's final blueprint, and it wasn't a weapon. It was a lockdown, a failsafe designed to detect tampering." Danziger realized, too, late, that Renaud had infiltrated his process. Every frequency, every sonic interval Danziger conceived was subtly altered by a hidden hand. In his final days, he attempted to reverse the changes by readjusting the mechanism. But Renaud had foreseen this, Holmes's voice lowered. So during the Marchmont rendezvous, just seconds after Danziger likely activated the resonator to test the frequency, he was exposed to a sound that was not his. It wasn't simply disruptive, it was targeted. The frequencies Raynaud used were tuned to resonate with the specific region of the brain responsible for regulating heart rate. A man with no known heart defects could still suffer an instant collapse. The perfect crime, silent, undetectable, and surgical. I leaned forward. But why kill Danziger? Why not just discredit him? Because Danziger I knew too much. Once he realized that Raynaud had used the amplifier as a weapon, he threatened to reveal it. Moreover, he had the proof, the watch with the blue coil. Holmes opened the small wooden box beside him and took out the second diagram, Danziger's hand-drawn reconstruction of the modified amplifier, annotated in German and French. He documented Raynaud's additions, the composition of the alloy, the resonance of the coil, the narrow sound window tuned between 37 and 42 Hertz. Danziger not only identified the manipulation, but he also created a recording of it, encoded in the coil itself. That Raynaud destroyed in the booby-trapped apartment, I said softly. Holmes's eyes met mine. Yes, but that act was also his undoing, for he believed wrongly that Danziger had left only physical artifacts. He didn't count on Danziger writing to himself in the language of sound. He didn't understand that even without a physical watch, frequencies could be traced, reproduced, and most damningly, tested, come from the same alloy that Raynaud used in his other orders. At this, Holmes turned to a small table beside the fireplace, on which lay the dismantled carriage clock that had once belonged to Philip Marchmont. He touched a coiled spring with the tip of his pen. This spring, he said, contains traces of the same ruthenium beryllium alloy found in the blue coil. Marchmont claimed the clock was a family heirloom. In truth, it was a custom piece, commissioned not for timekeeping, but for essay. He was Raynaud's boss, a collector of dangerous curiosities. He wanted proof of the device's work. And Mrs. Duval? Holmes sighed. Duval is a more complicated case. She didn't kill, but she knew what she was playing with. She encouraged Danziger to explore the limits of sound perception. She provided the funding. She provided Raynaud with design, commissions. And when Danziger began to question the implications of their work, she withdrew, conveniently, under cover of a sudden illness. He paused, then added, "She was afraid, not of the science, but of what it might reveal, of what it might say about her own complicity." I sat in stunned silence. So in the end it was a triangle. Danziger the creator, Duval the preserver, Raynaud the corrupter. Holmes nodded. 3 parts of a device, 3 voices in a chord. When someone tried to change the music, they were silenced. He stood up, and walked slowly to the window where the rain was beginning to ease. Outside, the street shone in the early evening light. The chime of a distant church bell echoed faintly across the rooftops. Holmes spoke without turning around. "Watson, you know what separates science from witchcraft? I guess you'll tell me. Method promises of witchcraft. Science proves Raynaud offered the promise, a way to control perception. But Danziger was the only one who understood the danger of proving it. That proof became his death." He fell silent again, watching the street below as if expecting time itself to stop. After a long time, I spoke. "What now? Lestrade will charge Raynaud under the Prevention of Cruel Practices Act. There is no law for sonic homicide, but they will be content with conspiracy, illegal experiments, and the falsification of dangerous materials. And Marchmont. He will be implicated, but I suspect the courts will treat him as a facilitator rather than an architect. He might be avoided, he might be fined, but he'll get away with it. I felt a wave of frustration. But this seems unfair. Holmes then turned to me, his face calm. Justice is not always symmetrical, Watson. Even the finest mechanisms allow the gears to loosen. Then, as if the weight of the matter had begun to settle in memory rather than immediacy, Holmes returned to his chair and picked up his violin. He drew the bow once, twice across the strings, tuning them until the pitch was just right, and then in the fading light of Baker Street, he began to play. It's not a sad tune, nor a triumphant one, but something measured, clean, precise. A melody that moves in seconds, not to kill, not to haunt, but to remind us that time, like truth, can be delayed. But it never forgets its rhythm. The days following Renault's arrest were curiously calm. In the bustling heart of London, where fog hung in the alleyways and taxi wheels splattered the rain-slicked cobblestones, the city churned at its usual indifferent pace. And yet, at 221B Baker Street, a silence persisted, a peculiar silence, as if the violent frequency that had underpinned Felix Danziger's death had left behind a resonance of its own. Holmes sat in his chair for hours, not inactive, but thoughtful. He hadn't touched his violin since that last solitary melody. Instead, he busied himself reading obscure scientific journals, writing private letters, and writing what I assumed was a monograph on harmonic weaponization, though he gave no title or details. As for me, I struggled with a lingering unease. I'd seen murders before, stabbings, shootings, poisonings, but this was intentional murder, by mathematics, a death delivered not by brute force or bitter motive, but by a manipulation of what constantly surrounds us, sound. The idea that something as invisible and seemingly harmless as frequency could be turned into a scalpel haunted me. It was perhaps a week later when Lestrade visited him. The inspector looked particularly grave, even for him, and Holmes, who was staring absently at a coiled spring on the table, motioned him to sit down without a word. Lestrade accepted the invitation but said nothing for a while. "We've officially charged him," he said finally. "Renault, I mean. Possession of illegal scientific instruments, criminal endangerment, reckless use of experimental equipment, but no murder charges," Holmes added. Lestrade sighed. "There is no precedent, Holmes. No law covers death by sound, no legal framework for frequencies as deadly instruments, and the only physical record we have, Danziger's plan, is a drawing, not a device. It could take months before Crown chemists can reproduce the alloy analysis, which means Renault can walk," Holmes said flatly. "Which means his lawyer has already applied for bail," Lestrade replied. "Refused so far, but I wouldn't bet on it being allowed." Holmes didn't answer immediately. He took a deep breath, then said, "And Duval?" "She's disappeared," Lestrade muttered, rubbing his forehead. "Packed up her residence on Cheney Walk 3 days ago. The housekeeper claims she received a telegram and left before dusk. No forwarding address," I spoke up. "And Marchmont?" "Under observation, he plays the role of the unwitting patron. He claims that Renault lied to him about the nature of the devices. He insists that he believed them to be musical innovations." Holmes gave a hollow laugh. "Marchmont is a dilettante with a flea's conscience, but he wasn't the one who rewired the amplifier. That hand was Renault's." Lestrade stood up and took a folded note from his pocket. "The only new evidence we've discovered is this, found in a second compartment in Danziger's office. It's addressed to you." Holmes took it carefully, opened the single sheet of paper, and read silently. Then he handed it to me. It read, "If I die, it will be because I misjudged the threshold, believing that mastery of time made me invulnerable. Holmes, if you find this, know that sound is not the enemy. Blindness is." Those who hear only what they expect will be deaf to danger. Protect the silence. It is not the absence of sound, but the space where truth begins to resonate. FDI folded the letter gently. He knew, I whispered. Holmes nodded. Danziger realized too late that he had created a mechanism that others could manipulate. His mind was of integrity, Watson. But integrity cannot protect you from those who exploit. Genius. Lestrade watched Holmes closely. I don't think you'll let this go. Not while Reynaud is free, Holmes replied. There are other avenues to justice. I looked between them. You mean? Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he stood up and walked over to the cabinet where he kept his files. From a lower drawer, he pulled out a slim folder labeled only E, unresolved Charles active. He placed Reynaud's name there and closed it with quiet finality. Then he turned to Lestrade. Let him go. Let him think the system has failed. Let him relax. You intend to follow him, Lestrade guessed. Holmes said nothing, but the gleam in his eyes was answer enough. That evening, Holmes and I walked together in Marylebone. It wasn't our usual practice, but something about the evening air, cool and calm with the faint chime of distant bells, invited reflection. We passed a small shop window displaying a collection of restored clocks. Holmes paused. They tick, in unison, he observed, but they were never meant to. I looked inside. You mean it's not natural? I mean it's an illusion. Each clock ticks independently, but placed close enough together, they begin to influence each other, micro-adjustments. Very subtle rhythmic pressure. Soon they're synchronized. He turned away. That's how minds like Reynaud's work, not by overwhelming force, but by influence. Small, quiet, consistent, until the whole world follows the same rhythm. We walked in silence for a while. Then Holmes said almost absently, "Have you heard it, Watson?" Heard what? The fatal note. I thought for a moment. I don't know. Maybe not. Most wouldn't, he said quietly. That's what makes it so dangerous. We returned to Baker Street shortly after. Holmes immediately went to the desk and began to compose a letter, probably addressed to a chemist, or perhaps to one of his agents scattered across Europe. I watched him for a moment, then quietly went into the living room. I stood before the fire, letting the warmth seep into my hands, and reflected on the affair that had cost a man his life without a murmur, without a wound. It was then that I realized something subtle but important. This case was not solved in the traditional sense. The killer had been arrested but not convicted. The conspiracy had been uncovered but not dismantled. The danger, though named, had not yet been neutralized, and Holmes knew it. But he also knew that the truth, like time, doesn't always strike like thunder. Sometimes it ticks, quietly, patiently, waiting for its moment. And when that happened, he wouldn't need to shout. It was a few weeks later, on a particularly clear May morning, that the final wave of the Danziger affair reached our doors. I had then consigned my notes to a leather-bound folder and begun to organize the scattered remnants of the case into a coherent narrative. Yet Holmes, as was his habit once a case was officially concluded, had hardly mentioned it since. He seemed absorbed in a private matter, a series of coded telegrams arriving from the continent, a sheaf of notes in French, and two curious parcels, marked with chemical hazard labels from the Royal Society of Chemists. What precisely occupied him during these quiet days, I could only speculate, but I suspected that his attention had not really been diverted from Reynaud. Holmes seldom relaxed his hold on a man whose nature was not only criminal but intellectually dangerous, and even though the justice system had weakened, Holmes was not left behind. But that morning, a letter arrived. No postmark, no return address. Just a crisp, wax-sealed envelope of thick paper hand-delivered. Holmes opened it, read its contents, then silently passed it to me. He said, "You think the pace was mine, Mr. Holmes, but you're wrong. I only followed it. When you hear it again, and you will, don't confuse rhythm with design. There are others who listen more attentively than you." Or I lowered the paper, my heart racing. "Isn't he in custody?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "Released on bail. Vanished within 48 hours. No trace since. Vanished like breath on glass." "So it's not over?" "No," said Holmes. "It rarely is." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the sunlit bustle of Baker Street. "Reno isn't just a man, Watson. He's a symptom, the sign of something modern. Murder devoid of passion, rewritten in formulas, precision without morality." I joined him at the window. "And what do we do with such men?" Holmes was silent for a moment, then turned. "We stay faster, sharper. We stay listening." He walked over to the table and opened one of the packages he'd received earlier in the week. Inside was a small transparent coil mounted on a ceramic base, eerily similar to the one used in Danziger's fatal watch, but marked in bright red with the word inert. He brought it to light. "That's how Reno won't kill again. We study it. We make it known. We do it. Impossible to hide. Do you want to publish?" Holmes nodded. "Anonymously, through scientific journals and universities, not as a case, but as a technical warning. When knowledge walks in the dark, it becomes a weapon, but brought to light, it can be diffused." It was a rare admission from Holmes, almost philosophical, but I understood the gravity of the situation. It wasn't a victory to be savored, but a responsibility to be passed on. That evening we dined. At Simpson's, where Holmes indulged in a rare roast beef while scanning the latest dispatches from Paris. He always kept an eye on trends. From all over Europe, strange reports had begun to pour in. An unexplained seizure in a conference room in Vienna, a fatal collapse in a private museum in Barcelona. Nothing conclusive, no names. But Holmes underlined each clipping and added them to a growing file titled Rhythmic Abnormalities. "Do you think they're connected?" I asked for cognac. "I think," he said, "that Reno was not the first to hear the frequency, and he will not be the last." There was something chilling in the simplicity of that sentence. A man made not of violence but of vibrations, a murderer whose weapon left no wound. Yet, as the night wore on, Holmes's mood brightened. He talked of other cases, missing manuscripts, stolen rubies, and a particular case involving a horse that had learned to count in Latin. But every now and then, his gaze turned to the file at his side. He listened again. A few weeks later, a note from Watson. "It's not often that I feel the need to add my own postscript to a case, but this one, this terrible silent story, seemed to merit some reflection beyond a mere retelling of the facts." Felix Danziger was not a famous man. His obituary, published in 2 columns in the London Chronic, was brief and factual. A renowned watchmaker suddenly drops by his workshop, known for restoring rare timepieces. There was no mention of murder, no allusion to sound frequencies or experimental deaths. The audience moved on. The clocks were ticking. But I remember it. I remember the young assistant, Peter Linklater, who left London shortly after the investigation. I received a letter from him. He had accepted a position at a small watchmaking school in Zurich. "I only repair what I understand now," he wrote. "Nothing more, nothing abstract." And I remember Danziger's last words, written on paper, not for acclaim or glory, but for one. "Protect the silence," he had said. And in those 4 words lies the real heart of the mystery, not the mechanical brilliance of the crime, not even the brilliance of Holmes's deduction, but the idea that silence, true silence, is not simply the absence of sound. It is the space in which truth becomes audible. One last evening, back to Baker Street. Holmes and I were sharing a rare moment of leisure. A light breeze from the window ruffled the curtains, and for once the fireplace remained cold. "I had a dream last night," I said suddenly, surprising myself. Holmes looked up, amused. "Say it." "I dreamed I heard a ticking, not of a clock, but of something beneath the floor. It got louder and louder until everything stopped, even time. Then I woke up." Holmes studied me for a moment, then said quietly, "And was it terrifying?" "No," I admitted, "only accurate." He gave a small smile. "Then you're fine. When it gets irregular, Watson, when the pace slows, it is when the danger returns." And with that, he grabbed his violin, placed it under his chin, and drew the bow. Single note sounds, sweet, perfect, unbroken, and time has moved on again.